Welcome everyone. It is 3 p.m. and it's time for the Server Room show. This is episode 54. Probably it's gonna be another two-part episode. We will see how far we can get with this one. Today's episode about the big controversial topic of all times in computer science, which is text editors. First, to see there has to be a we have to distinguish between text editors and IDEs. Very simply put, a text editor is a type of computer program which edits plain text. However, an integrated development environment, IDE, is a software application that provides comprehensive facilities to computer programmers for software development. An IDE normally consists of at least a source code editor, build automation tools, and a debugger. Some IDEs contain the necessary compiler, interpreter, or both, while others do not. The boundary between an IDE and another parts of the broader software development environment is not exactly well defined. Sometimes a version control system or various tools to simplify the construction of a graphical user interface are integrated. Many modern IDEs also have a class browser and object browser and a class hierarchy diagram for use in object-oriented software development. Let's talk about notable text editors, some old and some new one. ED and EX. ED is a line editor for Unix and Unix-like operating systems. It was one of the first parts of the Unix operating system that was developed in August 1969. It remains part of the POSIX and Open Group standards for Unix-based operating systems, alongside the more sophisticated full-screen editor VI. The ED text editor was one of the first three key elements of the Unix operating system. Assembler, editor, and shell, developed by Ken Thompson in August 1969 on a PDP-7 at AT&T Bell Labs. Many features of ED came from the QED text editor developed at Thompson's alma mater, University of California, Berkeley. Thompson was very familiar with QED and had re-implemented it on the CTSS and Multics systems. Thompson's versions of QED were notable as the first to implement regular expressions. Regular expressions are also implemented in ED, though their implementation is considerably less general than that in QED. Dennis M. Ritchie produced what Doug McElroy later described as the definitive ED, and the aspects of ED went on to influence EX, which in turn spawned VI. EX, short for Extended, is a line editor for Unix systems, originally written by Bill Joy in 1976, beginning with an earlier program written by Charles Haley. EX is heavily based on the text editor ED. The first versions of EX were modifications of a text editor EM named Editor for Mortals, as creator George Coulouris considered the cryptic commands of ED to be only suitable for immortals. Developed at Queen Mary's College in England and shown it to various people at Berkeley in the summer of 1976, including Bill Joy, who was very impressed with it. EM was a modified ED which had some added features which were useful on high-speed terminals. The earlier versions of EX also included features from the modified ED in use at UCLA and the ideas of Bill Joy and Charles Haley, who implemented most of the modifications to EM, which resulted in these early versions of EX. The original Unix editor, distributed with the Bell Labs version of the operating system in the 1970s, was the rather user-unfriendly ED. George Coulouris of Queen Mary College, London, which had installed Unix in 1973, developed an improved version called EM in 1975 that could take advantage of video terminals. While visiting Berkeley, Coulouris presented his program to Bill Joy, who modified it to be less demanding on the processor. Joyce version became EX and got included in the Berkeley Software Distribution BSD. EX was eventually given a full-screen visual interface, adding to its command line-oriented operation, thereby becoming the VI text editor. In recent times, EX is implemented as a personality of the VI program. Most variants of VI still have an EX mode, which is invoked using the command EX or from within VI for one command by typing the colon character. Although there is overlap between EX and VI functionality, some things can only be done with EX commands, so it remains useful when using VI. Interesting fact that the non-interactive Unix command grep was inspired by a common special use of QED and later ED, where the command grep grep means globally search for the regular expression RE and print the lines containing it. The Unix stream editor said implemented many of the scripting features of QED that were not supported by ED on Unix. I have to mention briefly what is a line editor, now that we spoke about ED and QED. In computing, a line editor is a text editor in which each editing command applies to one or more complete lines of text designated by the user. Line editors predate screen-based text editors and originated in an era when a computer operator typically interacted with a teleprinter, essentially a printer with a keyboard, with no video display and no ability to move a cursor interactively within a document. Line editors were also a feature of many home computers, avoiding the need for a more memory-intensive full-screen editor. Line editors are limited to typewriter keyboard text-oriented input and output methods. Most edits are a line at a time. Typing, editing, and document display do not occur simultaneously. Typically, typing does not enter text directly into the document. Instead, users modify the document text by entering these commands on a text-only terminal. Commands and text and corresponding output from the editor will scroll up from the bottom of the screen in order that they are entered or printed on the screen. Although the commands typically indicate the lines they modify, displaying the edited text within the context of larger portions of the document requires a separate command. Line editors keep a reference to the current line to which the entered commands usually are applied. In contrast, modern screen-based editors allow the user to interactively and directly navigate, select and modify portions of the document. Generally, line numbers or a search-based context, especially when making changes within lines, are used to specify which part of the document is to be edited or displayed. Early line editors included Colossal Typewriter, Expensive Typewriter, and QED. All three predated the advent of Unix. The former two ran on DEC PDP-1s, while the latter was a Unisys product. Numerous line editors are included with Unix and Linux. ED is considered the standard Unix editor, while EX extended and has more features, and SED was written for pattern-based text editing as part of a shell script. GNU Readline or GNU Readline is a line editor implemented as a library that is incorporated in many programs, such as Bash. For the first 10 years of the IBM PC, the only editor provided in DOS, MS-DOS, was the Edlin line editor. The next one is VI and Vim. VI is a screen-oriented text editor originally created for the Unix operating system. The portable subset of the behavior of VI and programs based on it and the EX editor language supported within these programs is described by and thus standardized by the single Unix specification and POSIX. The original code for VI was written by Bill Joy in 1976 as the visual mode for a line editor called EX that Joy had written with Chuck Haley. Bill Joyce EX 1.1 was released as part of the first Berkeley software distribution Unix release in March 1978. It was not until version 2.0 of EX, released as part of second BSD in May 1979, that the editor was installed under the name VI, which took users straight into EXE's visual mode, and the name by which it is known today. Some current implementations of VI can trace their source code ancestry to Bill Joy, others are completely new, largely compatible re-implementations. The name VI is derived from the shortest unambiguous abbreviation for the EX command visual, which switches the EX line editor to visual mode. In addition to various non-free software variants of VI distributed with proprietary implementations of Unix, VI was open sourced with OpenSolaris, and several free and open source software VI clones exist. Many of the ideas in EXE's visual mode, as known as VI, were taken from other software that existed at the time. According to Bill Joy, inspiration for VI's visual mode came from the Bravo editor, which was a B-model editor. In an interview about VI's origins, Joyce said the following: "A lot of ideas for the screen editing mode were stolen from a Bravo manual I surreptitiously looked at and copied. Dot is really the double escape from Bravo, the redo command. Most of the stuff was stolen. There were some things stolen from ED. We got a manual page for the Toronto version of ED, which I think Rob Pike had something to do with. We took some of the regular expression extensions out of that." It's from an interview with Bill Joy done by Jim Joyce. I left the link to the whole interview in the show notes. Joy used the Lear Siegler ADM3A terminal. On this terminal, the escape key was at the location nowadays occupied by the tab key on the widely used IBM PC keyboard, on the left side of the alphabetic part of the keyboard, one row above the middle row. This made it convenient choice for switching VI modes. Also, the keys H, J, K, and L served double duty as cursor movement keys and were inscribed with arrows on this keyboard, which is why VI uses them in that way. The ADM3A had no other cursor keys. Joy explained that the terse single character commands and the ability to type ahead of the display were a result of the slow 300 baud modem he used when developing the software, and that he wanted to be productive when the screen was painting slower than he could think. I left a screenshot of the ADM3A terminal keyboard layout so you can see the placement of the escape character exactly on the place where nowadays the tab key would be, and you can see the arrow keys marked on H, J, K, and L. Bill Joy explains in this previously mentioned interview done by Jim Joyce that he nearly fully implemented multi-Windows mode for VI, which is interesting because it's something, as later we'll see, it's something very particular to Emacs, at least for me, and this multi-window or multi-buffer, or how best to call it, is very particular for Emacs, and if it would ever existed in VI, then I think it would be a pretty different comparison between Emacs and VI, with this added benefits, so to say, to VI. It would be interesting. It could have been interesting, so to say. Here is a quote regarding that from the interview. "What actually happened was that I was in the process of adding multi-windows to VI when we installed our VAX, which would have been in December of 78. We didn't have any backups and the tape drive broke. I continued to work even without being able to do backups, and then the source code got scrunched and I didn't have a complete listing. I had almost rewritten all of the display code for Windows, and that was when I gave up. After that, I went back to the previous version and just documented the code, finished the manual, and closed it off. If that crunch had not happened, VI would have multiple windows and I might have put in some programmability, but I don't know. Again, this is from the interview with Bill Joy conducted by Joyce, and the link is in the show notes. Over the years since its creation, VI became the de facto standard Unix editor and the hacker favorite outside of the MIT until the rise of Emacs after about 1984. Emacs is the next one I want to talk about. You can see the screenshot Emacs in a Linux console, and when I read about in this interview of the multi-window mode, this is exactly what's in front of my eyes, and for me that's very feature of Emacs, so to say. So I can only imagine if VI would have the same, then it could have been very interesting. Emacs or editor macros Emacs is a family of text editors that are characterized by their extensibility. The manual for the most widely used variant, GNU Emacs, describes it as the extensible, customizable, self-documenting, real-time display editor. Development of the first Emacs began in the mid-1970s, and work on its direct descendant, GNU Emacs, continued actively as of 2020. The original Emacs was written in 1976 by David A. Moon and Guy L. Steele Jr. as a set of editor macros for the Teco editor. It was inspired by the ideas of the Teco macro editors, TechMac and Tmax. Emacs began during the 1970s at the MIT AI lab, whose PDP-6 and PDP-10 computers used incompatible time-sharing system, ITS, operating system that featured a default line editor known as tape editor and corrector, shortened to Teco. Unlike most modern text editors, Teco used separate modes in which the user would either add text, edit existing text, or display the document. One could not place characters directly into a document by typing them into Teco, but would instead enter a character I in the Teco command language, telling it to switch to input mode, enter the required characters, during which time the edited text was not displayed on the screen, and finally enter a character escape to switch the editor back to command mode. A similar technique was used to allow overtyping. This behavior is similar to that of the program ed. E had another feature that Teco lagged. Teco was a page, random access editing was the feature that Teco lagged. Teco was a page sequential editor that was designed for editing page paper tape on the PDP-1 and typically allowed editing on only one page at a time in the order of the pages in the file. Instead of adopting E's approach of structuring the file for page random access on disk, Stallman modified Teco to handle large buffers more efficiently and changed its file management method to read, edit, and write the entire file as a single buffer. Almost all modern editors use this approach. Richard Stallman visited the Stanford AI lab in 1972 or 1974 and saw the lab's e-editor written by Fred Wright. He was impressed by the editor's intuitive what you see is what you get behavior, which has since become the default behavior of most modern text editors. He returned to MIT, where Carl Michelson, a hacker at the EI lab, had added to Teco combined display editing mode called Control R that allowed the screen display to be updated each time the user entered the keystroke. Stallman reimplemented this mode to run efficiently and then added a macro feature to the Teco display editing mode that allowed the user to redefine any keystroke to run a Teco program. The new version of Teco quickly became popular at the EI lab and soon accumulated a large collection of custom macros whose names often ended in Mac or Max, which stood for macro. 2 years later, guys still took one of the project of unifying the diverse macro into a single set. Steele and Stallman finished implementation, included facilities for extending and documenting the new macro set. The resulting system was called Emacs, which stood for editing macros, alternatively E with macros. Stallman picked the name Emacs because E was not in use, an abbreviation on the ITS at the time, and apocryphal hacker co-acknowledges that the program was named after Emac and Bolio's, a popular Cambridge ice cream store. The first operational Emacs system existed in late 1976. In the following years, programmers wrote a variety of Emacs-like editors for other computer systems. James Gosling, who would later invent News and the Java programming language, wrote Gosling Emacs in 1981. The first Emacs-like editor to run on Unix, Gosling Emacs, was written in C and used mock Lisp, a language with Lisp-like syntax as an extensive extension language. The most popular and most ported version of Emacs is GNU Emacs, which was created by Richard Stallman for the GNU project. In 1976, Stallman wrote the first Emacs editor macros, and in 1984 began work on GNU Emacs to produce a free software alternate to the proprietary Gosling Emacs. GNU Emacs was initially based on Gosling Emacs, but Stallman's replacement of its mock Lisp interpreter with a true Lisp interpreter required that nearly all of its code be rewritten. This became the first program released by the nascent GNU project. GNU Emacs is written in C and provides Emacs Lisp, also implemented in C, as an extension language. Version 13, the first public release, was made on March 20th of 1985. The first widely distributed version of GNU Emacs was version 15.34, released later in 1985. Early versions of GNU Emacs were numbered as 1.x.x, with the initial digit denoting the version of the C core. The 1 was dropped after version 1.12, as it was thought that the major number would never change, and thus the major version skipped from 1 to 13. A new third version number was added to represent changes made by user sites. In the current numbering scheme, a number with 2 components signifies a release version, with development versions having 3 components. GNU Emacs was later ported to the Unix operating system. It offered more features than Gosling's Emacs, in particular a full-featured Lisp as its extension language, and soon replaced Gosling Emacs as the de facto Unix Emacs editor. Emacs has over 10,000 built-in commands, and its users interface allow the user to combine these commands into macros to automate work. Implementations of Emacs typically feature a dialect of the Lisp programming language that provides a deep extension capability, allowing users and developers to write new commands and applications for the editor. Extensions have been written to manage email, files, outlines, and RSS feeds, as well as clones of Elisa, Pong, Conways, Live, Snake, and Tetris. Emacs is, along with VI, one of the 2 main contenders in the traditional editor wars of Unix culture. Emacs is among the oldest free and open source projects still under development. I think this was enough for part 1, and I will continue from here to part 2. I might add some additional text editor. I think it's worth to mention, also including some from the modern ones. As I mentioned, sometimes the line between a simple text editor versus an IDE is not exactly well defined, or let's say even boundary between a simple IDE and the rest of the software development environments is not well defined, because if you look at Emacs, perhaps out of the box you can call it a text editor, and the same could be true for VI, but the moment you start adding these add-ons and plugins and extensions to both of them, you can end up with, as you saw, with an email client or a newsreader client. Definitely you can edit source code and run it. It does syntax highlighting. So I think in this sense, neither Emacs nor VI is just simply a text editor anymore, but they are definitely considered one of the, as I just said, one of the basic text editors, the two main contenders in the traditional editor wars of Unix culture. People up until today argue about Emacs and VI, and that which one is better and why. Honestly, I normally have both of them installed. VI is easier for me to use. Emacs has a much bigger learning curve, and those keyboard combination can be very, very painful on the wrist, at least for me. And it's hard to map in my brain those very strange keyboard combinations to give an action. I know that there are other versions of Emacs, like Doom Emacs is a very famous one, which eliminates some of these problems and uses a bit more friendly keyboard combinations out of the box, which is more human-like, to be honest. But still, Emacs has a much bigger learning curve in my opinion. VI is much more for what I need in this sense. I will, as I said, I will talk about some more text editors in part 2. I will include a couple of them, and yeah, I'm not gonna get into which text editor is better than the other, because I think everyone should choose the best tool for the job, whatever the job you want your text editor to do. And one editor can perhaps suit you better to your goal or to your purpose than another editor, and there are no two solutions equal. So maybe what works for you, it doesn't work for me, and vice versa. We will continue from here on part 2, and I'm happy that I managed to put Emacs and VI in the same episode, because those were the two big and main ones. And thank you very much for listening, and see you all next Saturday on episode 55, Text Editors Part 2. Have a nice afternoon.